January 16, 1944, 25,000 feet above the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. The air temperature outside Captain James Barrett's P-47 Thunderbolt registered at 58 degrees below zero. The cockpit glass had frosted over, except for a small circle he frantically kept clear with the heel of his gloved hand. Through it, he could see what no fighter pilot ever wanted to witness: an entire American bomber formation under attack with no way out. 20 B-17, flying fortresses from the 389th Bombardment Group, struggled through the skies over Essen, the crown jewel of Germany's Krupp works. Their bomb bay doors were closed, having just released their payloads, but they were still deep in enemy territory. Black puffs of flak burst around them, while more than 30 German fighters, Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, swarmed like hornets around the vulnerable bomber boxes. Barrett's throat tightened as he watched a B-17 erupt in flames. Through his radio, he heard the panicked voices of bomber crews counting enemy fighters. His own fighter squadron had been separated during the initial engagement, leaving him alone 5 miles south of the formation. The bombers had no escort, and Barrett was the only American fighter pilot who could see what was happening. "I'm coming in, big friends," he radioed, using the code name for bombers. His thumb flipped the gun switch to armed position. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine roar in response. Checking his fuel gauge, he grimaced. The fight over the target had already consumed much of his reserves. The bombers still had 100 miles to fly before reaching Allied fighter cover near the Belgian border. No one in the 21st Fighter Group knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite battlefield history and save 200 American airmen from almost certain death over the smoke-filled skies of the Ruhr Valley. James Barrett was born on a small dairy farm outside Boise, Idaho, on August 12, 1917. The third of 5 children to Thomas and Eleanor Barrett, young James grew up with endless skies above him and tough work below. His father had fought briefly in the First World War before being shipped home with a leg wound that left him with a permanent limp. The elder Barrett rarely spoke of his wartime experience, but his silence on the matter spoke volumes to his observant son. The Barrett farm sat beneath a training route for mail planes, and James would often abandon his chores to watch the aircraft pass overhead. He built crude models from scraps of wood, hanging them from his bedroom ceiling with twine. By age 10, he knew he would fly someday. By 12, he could name every American aircraft in production. When his father caught him gazing upward when he should have been repairing fence posts, the punishment was always the same: extra chores and a stern lecture about responsibility. "Planes won't feed this family," Thomas would say, his weathered face impassive. "Dreams don't plant fields." Eleanor Barrett saw something different in her middle son. She secretly saved pennies to buy him aviation magazines, which James would read by lantern light after his siblings had fallen asleep. On his 16th birthday, when most farm boys received work tools, Eleanor presented him with a leather pilot's jacket she'd ordered from a catalog. Thomas Barrett said nothing, but nodded slightly, the closest he would come to blessing his son's aspirations. James excelled in school despite having to balance farm duties with his studies. His mathematics teacher, Mr. Hoskins, recognized the boy's aptitude and began lending him books on navigation and physics. "The sky runs on math," Hoskins told him. "Master numbers, and you'll master flight." The young man took this advice to heart, often solving complex navigation problems while sitting atop the barn roof during lunch breaks. In 1935, during the depths of the Great Depression, the Barrett farm suffered a catastrophic blow when drought killed most of their crops. James, then 18, watched his father's shoulders slump under the weight of mounting debts. Without telling his parents, he enlisted in the Army, sending most of his pay home to help save the family land. His aptitude tests revealed exceptional spatial awareness and mathematical ability, but the Army had no flight program for enlisted men at that time. Instead, he became a mechanic, learning aircraft engines from the inside out. He would later credit this experience with saving his life more than once. "I knew what would kill an engine and what it could survive," he told a reporter in 1946. "When my plane was hit over Germany, I knew exactly how far I could push it because I'd rebuilt those engines with my own hands." By 1940, as war engulfed Europe, the U.S. military began rapid expansion of its Air Corps. Barrett applied for flight training and was accepted in the third class of aviation cadets. His mechanical background gave him an edge, and instructors noted his natural feel for aircraft. He earned his wings in April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor would thrust America fully into the war. Barrett's initial combat deployment sent him to North Africa in early 1943, where he flew the P-40 Warhawk against Luftwaffe pilots who often had hundreds more combat hours than their American counterparts. Despite the disadvantage, Barrett scored 3 confirmed kills during the Tunisia campaign, showing a natural talent for the three-dimensional chess game of aerial combat. When the call came for experienced pilots to transfer to England for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, Barrett volunteered immediately. By October 1943, he was flying a P-47 Thunderbolt with the 21st Fighter Group, tasked with escorting the vulnerable heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force deep into enemy territory. The bomber crews nicknamed him Shadow for his habit of flying tight escort, often positioning his fighter so close to the bomber's wings that his silhouette would cast a shadow across their fuselage. While other escort pilots sometimes chased glory by seeking out enemy fighters miles from the formation, Barrett never strayed far from the bombers he was assigned to protect. "My job isn't to be an ace," he once told his wingman, Lieutenant Michael Dolan. "My job is to bring those boys home." By January 1944, Barrett had 7 confirmed kills and had earned a reputation as a steady, reliable pilot who never took unnecessary risks. His commander, Colonel William Thompson, described him as not our flashiest pilot, but the one I'd want watching my back in a fight. Fellow pilots respected Barrett's methodical approach to combat and his encyclopedic knowledge of both Allied and enemy aircraft. In the officers' mess, younger pilots would gather around as he sketched engine diagrams on napkins, explaining the vulnerabilities of the Messerschmitt 109 or the fuel system weaknesses of the Focke-Wulf 190. "Know your enemy's machine better than he does," Barrett would say, "and you'll see his defeat before he does." What made Barrett particularly valuable was his understanding of bomber formations and defensive tactics. He had spent countless hours studying with bomber crews, learning their procedures and vulnerabilities. He could recite from memory the blind spots in a B-17's defensive gun coverage and knew precisely where German fighters preferred to attack. On the morning of January 16, 1944, Barrett and 11 other Thunderbolts from the 21st Fighter Group took off from their base at Manston to provide withdrawal support for bombers targeting the Krupp Armament Works in Essen. Winter weather had delayed operations for days, but a brief predicted clearing over the target prompted 8th Air Force commanders to launch the raid, despite forecasts of severe weather returning in the afternoon. As Barrett climbed through 20,000 feet, he watched his wingman disappear into a cloud bank that wasn't supposed to be there. Radio discipline broke down as fighter pilots called blindly for their flight leaders. What should have been a textbook escort mission had turned into chaos before they even reached German airspace. Germany's Ruhr Valley, often called the Forge of the Third Reich, was the industrial heartland that powered the Nazi war machine. Sprawling factories, steel mills, and chemical plants were concentrated in cities like Essen, Duisburg, and Dortmund, making the region a priority target for Allied bombers. But the Ruhr was also the most heavily defended area in Europe. Over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns ringed the valley, while radar-guided night fighters and day interceptors operated from a dozen nearby airfields. The Germans had also pioneered an insidious defense that cost many Allied lives. They burned oil and coal to create an artificial smokescreen that often concealed entire cities from the bombers' sight. By 1944, Allied planners recognized that crippling the Ruhr's industrial output was essential to winning the war. The massive factories produced everything from panzer tanks to artillery shells to aircraft engines. Every week these plants remained operational meant thousands more weapons reaching German forces on the eastern and western fronts. For bomber crews, missions to the Ruhr were considered among the most dangerous assignments. Veterans called it the Flak Alley, or simply the Black Heart, for the dense patterns of anti-aircraft bursts that filled the sky. A B-17 navigator who survived 25 missions later wrote, "We could see the Ruhr from 100 miles away. Not the land itself, but the wall of flak waiting for us." The 389th Bombardment Group, flying that January day, had already suffered grievous losses in previous raids on the region. Of the original crews that arrived in England in mid-1943, fewer than 30% remained. The rest had been shot down, killed, wounded, or reached the end of their 25-mission tour. The new replacement crews were younger, less experienced, and terrified of what veterans had told them about the Ruhr. Many had never faced determined enemy fighter opposition, as the introduction of the long-range P-51 Mustang had begun to shift air superiority toward the Allies. But the P-51s were still arriving in small numbers, and many missions still relied on the shorter-range P-47 Thunderbolts that couldn't escort bombers all the way to distant targets and back. That January morning, weather forecasters had predicted clear skies over the target, with cloud cover providing protection during the initial approach. Instead, bomber and fighter formations encountered unpredicted storm fronts that scattered the precisely timed formations. The 389th found themselves alone, without their planned fighter escort, as they approached the target. German radar operators noted the approaching bombers and scrambled 3 squadrons of fighters from airfields near Dusseldorf and Cologne. The Luftwaffe pilots, many with hundreds of combat missions, recognized the opportunity presented by isolated bomber formations. They waited until the B-17s had dropped their bombs, when the heavy aircraft would be most vulnerable, as they began their turn toward home. As the massive air battle unfolded, the industrial might that both sides fought to control continued production below. Factory workers, mostly conscripted laborers from occupied countries and concentration camps, toiled in the cavernous Krupp works, even as bombs fell nearby. German civil defense teams stood ready with fire hoses and emergency equipment, drilled to return facilities to operation within hours of an attack. For the American airmen high above, the strategic importance of their target offered little comfort as the sky filled with tracers and exploding shells. They were fighting for their lives in an arena where a single mistake meant death, 25,000 feet above enemy territory with no place to hide. The B-17s of the 389th had just completed their bombing run when the first wave of German fighters struck. Luftwaffe tactics had evolved over years of combat against American bombers, rather than attacking from behind. Where the B-17's deadly tail guns could respond, the German pilots preferred high-speed frontal passes or attacks from below, where defensive coverage was weakest. Major Robert Jenkins, commander of the lead bomber Carolina Queen, watched in horror as 3 of his aircraft erupted in flames within the first minute of the attack. Through his interphone, he ordered the formation to tighten up, knowing that dispersed bombers were easy prey. Close it up, he shouted, as his bomber shuddered from a near miss. Keep those guns firing. The 950 caliber machine guns on each flying fortress spat back at the attacking fighters, creating a web of defensive fire. But the Germans had the advantage of speed, diving through the formation and zooming away before gunners could track them effectively. Lieutenant Carl Schmidt, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot with 62 kills to his credit, led his staffel of Me-109s in a textbook attack on the low squadron. His pilots approached from 7 o'clock low, in the sun, making them difficult to spot until they opened fire. Schmidt targeted the lead bomber, aiming for the vulnerable engines. "Achtung! Stagger formation attack in sequence," he ordered in German, Aim for engines and wing roots." One by one, his fighters peeled off, each focusing on a different bomber. Their 20-millimeter cannon shells tore through the aluminum skin of the American aircraft, shredding control cables and igniting fuel tanks. On the American side, Technical Sergeant William O'Malley manned the ball turret on Lucky Lady, hanging in a glass bubble beneath his bomber. He had the best view of the attacking fighters, but also the most vulnerable position. If his bomber was hit badly, he might be trapped in the turret as the aircraft plummeted. "Fighters at 7 o'clock low," he called over the interphone. "Christ, there are dozens of them!" O'Malley swiveled his twin .50 caliber guns and opened fire on an approaching Me-109, watching with satisfaction as his tracers walked across its wing route. The German fighter rolled away, trailing smoke, but two more took its place. In the high squadron, Captain Martin Daniels fought to keep his crippled B-17 in formation after an explosive cannon shell punctured his No. 3 engine. Black smoke poured from the damaged power plant, and his flight engineer reported that the hydraulic system was losing pressure. "Feather No. 3, Daniels ordered, deciding to shut down the engine before it caught fire. With only 3 engines, his bomber would struggle to maintain speed and altitude, making it an even more tempting target for the circling fighters. The remaining bombers closed ranks around damaged aircraft, their gunners creating overlapping fields of fire. But with each passing minute, another flying fortress would fall out of formation, either damaged beyond ability to keep up or plummeting toward the ground with fatal wounds. Major Jenkins counted his remaining aircraft. Of the original 20 bombers that had crossed the German coast, only 14 remained in formation. 3 were visibly damaged, trailing smoke or limping along with feathered propellers. It was at this moment of crisis that a single P-47 Thunderbolt appeared, diving toward the embattled bomber formation from high above. Captain Barrett had become separated from his squadron during their transit through unexpected cloud cover over Belgium. Breaking into clear air, he found himself alone, 5 miles south of where the bomber stream should have been. Using his exceptional navigation skills, he plotted an intercept course, climbing to 30,000 feet to gain a tactical advantage. When he finally spotted the bombers, they were already under heavy attack. Through gaps in the clouds, he could see black bursts of flak and the telltale contrails of diving enemy fighters. Without hesitation, he pushed his Thunderbolt into a steep dive, building speed rapidly as he raced to intervene. His radio crackled with distress calls from the bomber crews. Though outnumbered more than 30-1, Barrett never considered waiting for reinforcements. Each second meant another bomber at risk, another 8 or 10 young airmen who might not return home. As the first Messerschmitt came into his gun sights, Barrett squeezed the trigger of his .850 caliber machine guns. The German fighter, focused on lining up a shot on a straggling B-17, never saw the Thunderbolt approaching from above. Barrett's bullets shredded its right wing, sending it tumbling away in a fatal spin. Banking hard, he targeted another enemy fighter. This one saw him coming and reversed course, engaging Barrett in a swirling dogfight. The American's superior high-altitude performance gave him an edge, and after a series of tight turns, he maneuvered behind the Messerschmitt and sent another burst into its cockpit. The German aircraft exploded spectacularly, confirming Barrett's 9th kill. But he knew he couldn't defeat 30 enemy fighters alone through traditional combat. He needed a strategy to protect the bombers until they reached the safety of the Belgian border, where Allied fighter cover would be waiting. As he climbed back to altitude, a desperate plan formed in his mind. The situation grew more dire with each passing minute. Despite Barrett's initial success in shooting down 2 enemy fighters, the German attack continued unabated. The Luftwaffe pilots, momentarily distracted by the appearance of an American fighter, quickly realized it was a single plane and resumed their assault on the bomber formation. Major Jenkins, in the lead B-17, watched his fuel gauges with growing concern. Combat maneuvering burned fuel at an alarming rate, and several of his aircraft reported damage to their fuel systems. Even if they escaped the fighters, they might not have enough range to reach England. "All aircraft conserve fuel," he ordered. reduce power 5%. In the lowest squadron, the B-17 Missouri Mule took a direct hit to its number 2 engine. The propeller, unable to feather properly, began to windmill, creating drag that pulled the bomber to the left. Its pilot, Lieutenant Frank Holloway, fought the controls as the aircraft slipped out of formation. "We're losing altitude," his co-pilot reported. "Can't maintain position." As Missouri Mule fell behind, 3 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters pounced on the vulnerable bomber. Its gunners fought back desperately, but the outcome seemed inevitable. The German fighters circled like wolves, making coordinated attacks from different angles to split the defensive fire. From his vantage point above the formation, Captain Barrett saw the bomber's plight. He had just dispatched another Me-109, his 3rd kill of the day, but his ammunition was running dangerously low. Looking at his fuel gauge, he made a fateful decision, one that would save 200 men but place his own life in terrible jeopardy. Barrett had noticed that his second victim, the Messerschmitt, that had exploded spectacularly, had created a brief cloud of dense black smoke and debris. The German fighters had momentarily broken off their attack, unwilling to fly through the hazardous cloud. This observation sparked an idea born of equal parts desperation and inspiration. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built around a massive radial engine that contained a complex oil circulation system to cool its 18 cylinders. If damaged in the right way, that system could produce enormous quantities of thick, black smoke, without necessarily causing an immediate catastrophic failure. Barrett knew the engineering of his aircraft intimately from his days as a mechanic. He understood exactly which oil lines, if ruptured, would create the densest smoke while still allowing the engine to function long enough to complete his plan. Climbing to 2,000 feet above the formation, Barrett lined up his Thunderbolt with the path of the German attack. He switched off his gun camera. What he was about to do would not be for glory or confirmed kills. Taking a deep breath, he thumbed the microphone. "Big friends, this is Shadow. Prepare for smoke cover. Follow directly behind me, heading 090. Do not deviate from my course. Repeat, do not deviate." Major Jenkins recognized Barrett's call sign immediately. Though puzzled by the message, he trusted the fighter pilot's judgment. "Roger, Shadow. Formation will comply." Barrett pushed his aircraft into a shallow dive, positioning himself between the bombers and the approaching wave of German fighters. With a silent apology to his ground crew, he did something no pilot would normally contemplate. He deliberately fired a burst from his wing guns into his own engine cowling. The .50 caliber bullets tore through the carefully designed cowling and ruptured several oil lines exactly as he had intended. Within seconds, thick black smoke began pouring from his engine, creating a massive, expanding cloud behind his aircraft as oil hit the superheated exhaust stacks. The effect was immediate and dramatic. As Barrett flew a weaving pattern in front of the bomber formation, his damaged engine trailing dense black smoke, he created a makeshift curtain that concealed the B-17s from the attacking fighters. The bombers, following his instructions, flew directly through the artificial smokescreen. German pilots, unable to see their targets and unwilling to fly blindly into the potentially deadly cloud, broke off their attacks temporarily. They circled at a distance, waiting for the smoke to dissipate so they could resume their assault. But Barrett wasn't finished. His engine, though damaged, continued to run. Each time the smoke began to thin, he would change his throttle setting, causing fresh bursts of thick black emissions as different oil lines ruptured under the strain. He essentially turned his fighter into a giant smoke generator, creating a protective blanket that extended for almost a mile behind his aircraft. Lieutenant Carl Schmidt, leading the Luftwaffe attackers, cursed in frustration as his targets disappeared into the billowing darkness. "Was ist das?" he demanded over his radio. "Where did this smoke come from?" His wingman responded, "It's coming from that single fighter, Herr Leutnant. He's damaged, but still flying." Schmidt recognized the tactic for what it was. A desperate gambit by a single American pilot to protect the bomber formation. He ordered his fighters to spread out, some climbing above the smoke while others descended below it, attempting to regain visual contact with their prey. Inside the bomber formation, Gunners squinted through the acrid smoke, keeping their weapons trained outward, though they could barely see beyond their wingtips. The pilots, flying on instruments and maintaining tight formation with the aircraft ahead of them, trusted Barrett to lead them to safety. Captain Daniels, still nursing his damaged B-17 on 3 engines, found unexpected relief in the concealment. "Whatever that fighter jock is doing," he told his co-pilot, "he's buying us time." For Barrett, each minute became a desperate calculation. His engine temperature gauge was climbing dangerously as the remaining oil burned away. Warning lights illuminated his cockpit as systems began to fail. The smoke that saved the bombers was slowly killing his aircraft. He knew he couldn't maintain the smokescreen indefinitely. His plan was to escort the formation as far as possible toward Allied territory, ideally reaching the point where other P-47s could take over the protection detail. But his engine had other ideas. 23 minutes into his improvised mission, Barrett's oil pressure dropped to near zero. His engine began to run rough, the massive radial coughing and sputtering as metal ground against metal without proper lubrication. Black smoke still poured from the cowling, but now it was the result of internal damage rather than his controlled oil leaks. Through gaps in the smoke, Barrett could see the Belgian border approaching. They had covered nearly 70 miles since he began his smokescreen maneuver. The Luftwaffe fighters still circled at a distance, periodically making probing attacks, but unable to coordinate an effective assault through the obscuring cloud. Major Jenkins's voice came through the radio. "Shadow, we have friendlies approaching from the west. P-47's full squadron. You're relieved." Barrett checked his engine gauges one last time. The temperature needle had pushed well into the red zone, and ominous knocking sounds emanated from the cowling. He had perhaps minutes before complete failure. "Roger that," he responded calmly, "beginning descent now." As Barrett peeled away from the formation, his engine seized completely. The massive propeller froze, creating sudden drag that nearly pitched the fighter into an uncontrollable dive. Fighting the controls, Barrett managed to establish a glide and began looking for a place to crash land in the Belgian countryside below. Behind him, the fresh P-47s from the 368th Fighter Group arrived, 12 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. They took up escort positions around the battered bomber formation, allowing Barrett's smoke trail to finally dissipate in the winter wind. Lieutenant Colonel James Agnew, leading the newly arrived fighters, spotted Barrett's stricken aircraft descending toward the ground. "Shadow, do you require assistance?" he radioed. "Negative," came the calm reply. "Engine failure. I'll put her down in that field ahead. You protect the heavies." Agnew acknowledged and turned his attention to the bombers. He counted 14 B-17s still in formation, many showing battle damage, but all still flying. It was an extraordinary survival rate for a formation that had faced such a determined attack deep in enemy territory. 5,000 feet below, Barrett lined up his dead-stick landing, aiming for a snow-covered pasture that appeared reasonably flat. With no power and limited control, he would get only one attempt. As the frozen ground rushed up to meet him, he pulled back on the stick, bleeding off the last of his airspeed just before touchdown. The Thunderbolt slammed into the field, its landing gear collapsing under the impact. It slid nearly 400 yards across the snow and mud before grinding to a halt at the edge of a small copse of trees. Remarkably, Barrett emerged from the crumpled cockpit with only minor injuries, a dislocated shoulder, and facial lacerations from his shattered canopy. Belgian resistance fighters, who had observed the aerial battle and Barrett's descent, reached him within hours. They hid him from German patrols and eventually connected him with an escape network that would lead him back to Allied lines over the course of the next 3 weeks. Meanwhile, all 14 remaining bombers of the 389th Bombardment Group reached England safely. They had suffered the loss of 6 aircraft during the initial attack, but Barrett's intervention had prevented what could have been the complete destruction of the formation. The immediate aftermath of Barrett's actions remained largely unknown to him as he made his perilous journey through occupied Belgium. Guided by resistance members, he traveled only at night, hiding in barns and cellars during daylight hours. German patrols actively searched for downed Allied airmen, and the penalty for civilians caught harboring them was death. 23 days after his crash landing, Barrett crossed into Allied territory near Antwerp, which had been liberated during the previous fall's offensive. He was immediately debriefed by intelligence officers who were initially skeptical of his account. "You're claiming you single-handedly protected an entire bomber formation?" a doubtful major asked him. "No, sir," Barrett replied. "I'm claiming I bought them time until proper escort arrived." The doubt vanished when reports from the bomber crews corroborated his story. Major Jenkins and several other pilots had filed detailed accounts of the mysterious smokescreen that had appeared at their most vulnerable moment. What's more, gun camera footage from the relief fighters had captured the final minutes of Barrett's escort, showing his smoke trail extending for miles behind the formation. Upon his return to England in February 1944, Barrett found himself summoned to 8th Air Force Headquarters. General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th, personally reviewed the reports of the mission. Impressed by Barrett's resourcefulness and sacrifice, Doolittle recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest military honor. The citation read, in part, "for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy." Captain Barrett, alone and outnumbered, interposed his aircraft between enemy fighters and vulnerable bombers, employing innovative tactics that preserved the lives of more than 140 airmen. Barrett's damaged Thunderbolt was eventually recovered by advancing Allied forces in September 1944. Engineers studying the wreckage marveled at his technical knowledge and precision. The bullet holes in the engine cowling showed expert placement, rupturing oil lines while avoiding critical components that would have caused immediate failure. "He knew exactly what he was doing," the chief engineer reported. "This wasn't desperation. It was applied expertise." For the crews of the bombers he saved, Barrett became something of a legend. They had watched in awe as a single fighter created a protective shroud that the dreaded Luftwaffe could not penetrate. In the officers' club at their base in East Anglia, they established a tradition of saving an empty chair and a full glass for shadow at their tables. Captain Martin Daniels, whose damaged B-17 might well have been lost without Barrett's intervention, later wrote, "We had angels watching over us that day, wearing the face of a farm boy from Idaho." Technical Sergeant William O'Malley, the ball turret gunner who had witnessed the entire event from his unique vantage point beneath his bomber, described the scene in a letter home. "Mom, I saw something today I'll never forget. One man stood against many, not with superior firepower, but with superior thinking. When I think I've given all I can give, I'll remember that smoke trail and find a little more courage." After recovery from his injuries, Barrett returned to combat in March 1944. He flew 37 additional missions before the end of the war, adding 6 more confirmed kills to his record. On April 7, 1945, just 1 month before Germany's surrender, he led a flight of 16 P-51 Mustangs on a deep penetration mission to Prague, Czechoslovakia. His aircraft was hit by flak during a strafing run on a railway yard. Though he managed to nurse his damaged fighter back to Allied lines, he crash-landed in France and suffered severe burns that ended his combat career. The immediate post-war period found Barrett recovering in a military hospital in San Diego. Like many combat veterans, he struggled with a transition to peacetime. The nightmares came frequently, visions of burning bombers falling from the sky and German fighters pursuing him through endless clouds. He seldom spoke of his experiences, even to the medical staff treating his burn injuries. In 1946, still undergoing painful skin grafts, he received an unexpected visitor. Major Robert Jenkins, commander of the bomber he had saved over the Ruhr, had tracked him down after months of inquiries. "I've been looking for you, Shadow," Jenkins said as he entered Barrett's hospital room. "A lot of men want to shake your hand." Over the next few hours, Jenkins shared the full impact of Barrett's actions that January day. Of the 147 airmen aboard the 14 bombers that returned safely, 133 completed their tours of duty and returned home. Many had children and grandchildren who would never have existed without Barrett's intervention. "You didn't just save us," Jenkins told him. "You saved generations." This perspective helped Barrett find meaning in his sacrifice and suffering. He began speaking more openly about his experiences, first to fellow patients in the hospital and later to wider audiences. His story of the smokescreen maneuver became part of fighter pilot lore studied at the Air Tactical School as an example of resourcefulness under extreme pressure. After his medical discharge in 1947, Barrett returned to Idaho, where he used his mechanical skills to establish a successful aviation maintenance business. He also created a scholarship fund for rural students interested in aerospace engineering, eventually helping more than 300 young men and women pursue careers in aviation. In 1954, a historian from the Air Force Association interviewed Barrett for a book about innovative air combat tactics. When asked if he had considered any alternative to his dangerous smokescreen strategy, Barrett's answer revealed much about his character. "Of course," he said, "I considered joining the fight conventionally, but the math didn't work. 30 against 1 meant I might get 3 or 4 before they got me. That would still leave most of the bombers unprotected." He paused, then added, "Sometimes the best way to fight isn't to fight at all, but to change the conditions of the battle." Barrett remained modest about his achievement for the rest of his life. When pressed about his heroism, he would typically deflect with humor. "The real heroes are the mechanics who had to rebuild engines after pilots like me abused them." On the 25th anniversary of the mission, in January 1969, Barrett received an invitation to a reunion in Chicago. There, in a hotel ballroom, he came face to face with 37 men from the bombers he had saved. Many brought their wives and children. Some brought photos of family members who couldn't attend. One by one they approached him, often with tears in their eyes, to express their gratitude. Barrett, never comfortable in the spotlight, found himself overwhelmed by the tangible evidence of his impact. The most poignant moment came when Technical Sergeant O'Malley, the former ball turret gunner, introduced Barrett to his daughter, a young woman in her 20s. "Her name is Jamie," O'Malley said quietly. "After you." Barrett lived to the age of 86, dying peacefully in his sleep on March 3, 2004. His funeral in Boise drew hundreds of attendees, including aging veterans and active-duty Air Force personnel. A missing man formation of F-16 fighters flew overhead, with one aircraft pulling upward out of formation to symbolize his passing. In his personal effects, his family found a small, worn leather notebook. Inside were the names of every man from the bomber formation he had saved, carefully recorded and maintained over decades. Beside some names were annotations: married 1946, 3 children, became a doctor. The final page contained a simple tally: original souls saved, 147. Estimated souls existing because of them, 912. Colonel William Thompson, Barrett's former commander who delivered the eulogy, summarized his legacy this way: "In battle, we measure victory in territory gained or enemies defeated." But James Barrett understood a deeper truth, that true victory is measured in lives preserved and futures safeguarded. One engine sacrificed, hundreds of souls saved. It was mathematics of the most profound kind. In 2006, a documentary filmmaker began collecting testimonials from the families of the airmen Barrett had saved. The resulting film, Shadows Smoke, revealed that his actions that January day had rippled across generations, ultimately affecting thousands of lives. Among the descendants of the bomber crews were doctors who had saved countless patients, teachers who had educated thousands of students, and even a congressman who had championed legislation protecting veterans. Barrett's smokescreen maneuver has been analyzed in military academies worldwide as an example of asymmetric problem-solving under extreme pressure. Air Force training now includes scenarios inspired by his actions, challenging pilots to think beyond conventional tactics when faced with overwhelming odds. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came in 2018, when the Air Force Research Laboratory unveiled a new defensive system for aircraft. The technology, which deploys specialized particles to confuse enemy targeting systems, was officially designated the Barrett Screen in his honor. James Barrett never sought glory or recognition. He was a farm boy who understood that sometimes sacrifice is necessary to protect others. His actions on that January day over the Ruhr Valley stand as testimony to the difference one individual can make when courage is paired with innovation. In the skies over Germany, when conventional fighting would have failed, he chose a different path. By turning his aircraft into a shield rather than a sword, he accomplished what seemed impossible, saving 20 bombers and their crews from almost certain destruction. As we look back on this remarkable story, we might ask ourselves, would we have the courage to make such a sacrifice? Would we see beyond the limitations of conventional thinking when lives depended on it? Would we be willing to damage our own aircraft, risking our own life, to protect others? Perhaps that's why Barrett's story continues to resonate decades later. It reminds us that heroism often manifests not in glory-seeking actions, but in quiet decisions to place others' lives above our own. It shows us that innovation born of desperation can sometimes achieve what overwhelming force cannot. Share this story so others remember what courage really means.